Lebanon is currently experiencing the worst economic crisis that any nation has felt since the mid-1800s. If you had $1,000,000 lira in the bank at the start of the war, today that would be worth about 30 cents. So imagine how bad things would have to be that when you tallied up the nation's problems, the economy barely even made the top 5. If Lebanon was a Frankenstein, by the 1990s, the only parts of it still working were the head and that one fist, Syria and Hezbollah. With the country now run like an Assadist puppet, the militias that had once sparked so much violence all had their wings clipped right down to the bone, be they Druze, Sunni, Palestinian, Maronite, Armenian, Greek, or even Shia. Everyone else would be forced to hand in their guns. And whether they did it out of a genuine desire to stop the bloodshed or just a fear that their kids would end up like a Shamoun, it was still the right thing to do. There was no true way forward without it. It's just for that to actually work, everyone would have to say yes. And Hezbollah said no. So the war wasn't over. For the most part, though, the Lebanese weren't even really involved anymore. This was an Iranian-Israeli thing. They were just the battleground. And for the next 35 years, their civil war would continue effectively without their involvement, which politically realigned the country into two pretty obvious camps, those who wanted to rebuild society and the Shia. Which kind of makes sense, really, because a sinking tide might lower all ships, but Hezbollah's was tied to an Iranian dock, and so while in theory they were just another subjugated part of this Lebanese mosaic, in practice they'd run their region far more autonomously than Syria had stopped those Christians from doing. The rules simply didn't apply to them. And now, just another part of Lebanese politics, they began to normalize their control. By the late 1990s, to call someone Hezbollah didn't even necessarily mean a terrorist anymore. It could have just as easily been, kindergarten teacher. And that wasn't her decision. That's just who ran the region. By 2006, they were running 12 schools, 4 hospitals. They were among the country's biggest employers. And most importantly, their budget didn't rely on Lebanon. It came from Iran, in the form of gold bars, no less, up to $700 million a year. That's 1/30 of the Lebanese GDP. And granted, it wasn't all in cash, but the point is that with Hezbollah, regardless of what was happening around you, you could expect to be paid. And to them, it was actually kind of better if the economy never improved at all, especially outside their areas, because if anybody else got power, presumably the first thing they do is disarm Hezbollah. And as a horrible side bonus, it was a lot easier to recruit walking corpses if they already lived in a dead world. However, for the rest of the country, fixing the economy was perhaps the only thing they could focus on that still felt positive. With no real say in the government beyond deciding which dog would sit in the warmest part of Assad's lap, even just a whiff of a better life was the carrot that kept those broken legs walking. And you can fit a lot of hope in a small place. In Saudi Arabia, they sensed opportunity. Beginning in the late 80s and solidifying with Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, the Saudi royal family found themselves as the primary Arab ally of the United States. It was a position that they would use to push that giant empire towards confrontation with their mutual enemies in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Iran. Wars they knew they could never fight alone. And so although their position had long demanded that they speak softly, in this new friend America, they'd find a big stick. Which, although those Saudis would never say it out loud, aligned them directly with the furthest right ideologues of Israeli politics. The two sides might never talk to each other directly, but in secret they'd be happy to work together as long as it meant pushing the US on that road towards war. In 1991, in exchange for fighting Iraq, the United States would be given the green light to host troops on Saudi soil. They'd even get to build a military base. It was a decision that would blow up in all of our faces. The 1991 invasion of Kuwait, despite becoming one of America's most complete military victories in its 200-year history, would signal the beginning of a Middle Eastern Cold War that the US would be drawn into seemingly unaware. But with this new giant ogre to protect them from reprisal, those royals would decide it was time to inject their horse into that great Lebanese race, a man named Rafik Hariri, a politically savvy Lebanese Sunni billionaire. To call him corrupt was like calling water a drink. He only spoke because Riyadh gave him the mic, but at the same time, nobody was expecting a utopia here. Everyone else was terrible too. All most Lebanese really wanted was a job that paid them more than $5 a day, and for many, this billionaire Hariri seemed like the best guy to get that for him. Or at the very least, the others certainly wouldn't. So running under the name The Future, he turned himself into a national symbol of an unspoken dream. He was the man who could bring back investment, the man who could rebuild downtown. Who knows? Maybe, just maybe, he might make things like they were before that hotel caught fire. Maybe Lebanon could be a real country again. And yeah, okay, he was Sunni, but just like that great Druze Fakhr al-Din, he'd made a promise to the Christians that their pockets would be lined too. This was a coalition of hope, them versus the Shia, although nobody would dare say that out loud. In 1996, he'd take the prime ministership and begin racking up massive public debts, redeveloping as much of the downtown core as his company Solidaire could snatch up. And of course, every building he'd renovate, he'd get a cut from. This wasn't altruism. He wasn't even giving people cash for their homes, just stock in the company that stole it from them. In other times, this might have been enough to spark a revolution, but now it was like, take what you could get. At least some stuff got built. It might not have been perfect. In fact, it was far from perfect, but nobody was expecting a utopia here. This was a world of silver linings, and the one people found in him was investment. But like with all dreams, eventually you gotta wake up. It's easy to take out loans and get that short-term boost, but it's hard to get real investment in a nation that won't stop going to war. Without an honest peace, without Syria and Israel both packing it up and heading home, all those massive loans were going to become an unstoppable problem. And yet, unfortunately, at the time, that was the least of their concerns. In the early 1990s, Israel would assassinate Hezbollah's interim leader, and with his death would come the arrival of a far more capable tactician, a force of a man named Hassan Nasrallah. Through him, Hezbollah would change from a few thousand terrorists into a genuine Lebanese social movement. He'd join the government and sweep every seat he contested, becoming a shadow administration to nearly a quarter of the country. And although he claimed to be a purely political force, it wasn't a well-kept secret that his assassins would break entire dynasties who pushed back against him. And it wasn't just in Lebanon where he changed that calculus, because soon after taking power, Nasrallah would import rockets with a range that made Israel's South Lebanese buffer state virtually irrelevant. All those thousands of innocent people who died to create it, now buried in a no man's land that didn't even matter. That great invasion of 1982, that dream of the Israeli far right, just creating a more capable enemy with an even stronger arsenal. But Israel couldn't just back down. Imagine the coup that would be for Hezbollah. They'd been there for a decade. Their proxies had done unforgivable things, things that were definitely going to blow back the second that they left. So if they were going to leave, and that was still a big if, the only acceptable way to do it was to leave with strength. Every member of Hezbollah would have to be killed, if not physically, at least politically. And that meant finding 3,000 people hidden among about 1.5 million, give or take, like a hay in a needle stack. And even worse, they were like zombies. One left alive, and they'd all come roaring back. The only real way to achieve it, in the eyes of the IDF, would be restarting the civil war. Let the Christians do to Hezbollah what they'd once done to the PLO. It wasn't like the locals didn't know who they were, they just weren't talking. So in July of 1993, they'd undertake Operation Accountability, a message carved onto a bullet and shot into the walls of those turtled northern elite. If they were going to let Hezbollah into the government to represent the nation, that made everything a target, the entire nation. If you didn't like that, we'll kick them out. Which in practice was primarily felt as a flood of refugees. The third publicly stated goal of that Israeli operation was that they were trying to overwhelm Beirut with Shia migrants. By filling the city, they hoped to see some anger like they'd seen 20 years before. Which, of course, the Christians rejected. It might as well have been suicide, both physically and politically. These weren't some foreign fighters coming from abroad. They were homegrown Lebanese fighting for their own country's freedom. This was 10 years into an Israeli occupation. Even if they wanted to kick Hezbollah out, which many people did, Syria would crucify them for saying it. Not a single Christian leader would take that risk. But then again, neither would Syria. And even on the whiff of a potential coalition against them, they'd have Samir Geagea, the only truly independent Christian leader remaining, imprisoned for crimes committed during the war. Of all the hundreds who'd committed horrors, only he'd be targeted, and it isn't complicated to guess why. But even if Geagea had remained free, neither the Christians nor the Lebanese government had any real way of stopping Hezbollah, and Israel knew that. For the most part, this was all just a PR exercise to explain why the conflict was being expanded again. It's a hard sell, the idea of a proxy war with Iran, but everybody understands if you say that Lebanon won't rein in their terrorists, especially since that was 100% true. But to put it bluntly, if Israel wanted Hezbollah out of politics, then this couldn't have been a worse move. It was like shoving the tick in further. Operation Accountability turned Hezbollah from a regional militant group into a genuine social cause. Because when something was destroyed by an Israeli bomb, it was Hezbollah who'd show up to help, not the Lebanese government. If you lost your home, you could expect a stack of crisp, fresh American dollars flown straight in from Iran. To quote former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, "When we entered Lebanon, there was no Hezbollah. We were accepted with perfumed rice and flowers. It was our presence there that created them." By 1995, the PLO might have been quiet, but man, Hezbollah certainly weren't. Trained and armed by Iranian special forces, they now had better soldiers, more rockets, money, and influence than any who had come before, and they were quickly becoming a greater challenge to Israel than even the most dedicated of the Palestinians. The trajectory of their rise was clear. To the average Israeli, it must have been like watching your government start a grease fire only to follow it up with a bucket of water, because in 1996, they'd invade again. And this time they'd claim it was a response to the rocket attacks, because there were always rocket attacks, so in a sense that was true, but the real reason was politics. The country was facing a revolution. The prime minister had agreed to a two-party state and then been assassinated by his own far right. In the accords that followed, the PLO would do exactly what the right wing feared and agree to hang up their guns. They'd form into the supposedly nonviolent Palestinian Authority, and Arafat would even pretend to hand power to a successor. It wasn't everything, but it was a strong first step. And in return, slowly but eventually, Israel would remove all those extremists they'd placed above the tank routes from Jordan, those who overlooked the Palestinian towns with malice in their hearts. Someday soon, they might even be able to remove those nets that covered the streets of their markets, no longer having to catch all the stones and garbage that were hailed down on them from above. For many Israelis, it would be a welcome attempt to solve what they saw as an endless cycle of pain and death that would only lead to their national destruction, an escape hatch to stop themselves from becoming that golem they feared. But to many others, it would be a betrayal of the very destruction that had led to their country's existence in the first place. To sign that document defied the nation's most important principle. You never back down. The schism that this caused in Israeli society would first come to a head in the late 1970s. In a shock election, the country swung further right than at any point in the national history and elected a prime minister who'd started his career as a literal terrorist. And that's not me saying that. That's Einstein. That's Churchill. That's Queen Elizabeth. In fact, until the election that brought him to power, he'd been considered a terrorist legally by virtually every single country on the planet. Israel would have to do an international campaign of diplomacy just to get him off the terror lists before he took office. And now, 20 years later, his successor was doing a bit too well in the polls. The government knew that if they didn't win this election, Israel could kiss that two-state solution goodbye, presumably forever. And so with their polls looking terrible and their image tainted by weakness, the government decided to show a bit of chutzpah, and they went at the throat of Hezbollah. Operation Grapes of Wrath was a week-long campaign that would backfire so spectacularly it would change your life. You sitting there watching this right now today. Because on day 7 of that PR onslaught, the IDF would deliberately shell a UN bunker outside the Lebanese village of Kana. The townspeople had all run there with their children to hide from the bombs. But the IDF would hit them with a shot so perfect you can imagine the operator yelling bullseye. And in 2021, they'd make the guy who ordered that shelling Prime Minister. 107 completely innocent people. Not Hezbollah, just women and children huddling in a room the entire world promised was safe. Israel would claim that the civilians had been shooting rockets at them, but when that lie fell apart, they'd say it was an accident and that they had no idea the UN was even there. But that too would be exposed as a lie. Eventually it became clear that they were watching the entire thing from a drone hovering overhead. And they made the guy who pulled the trigger Prime Minister. And yet we are all living in that recoil. Because in Saudi Arabia, a radicalized son of wealth named Osama bin Laden would capitalize on the international trauma of Kana to draw in young fanatical Sunnis who wanted to fight back against what they saw as increasing Western barbarism. He'd begun his crusade in the 80s with training from the Pentagon, but their alliance was never meant to last. And by the early 1990s, his protege had bombed the World Trade Center, and he was quickly becoming America's enemy number one. Like most fundamentalists of his time, his work was clearly inspired by what was happening in South Lebanon. The suicide bombers that Hezbollah had sent against Reagan's multinational force were the direct inspiration for the creation of al-Qaeda, and from their framework he'd begin putting together a coalition of Sunni terrorists who could put those Shia to shame. Everyone could already tell that this new era was leaning towards fundamentalism, and in bin Laden's mind, whoever could take that halo was also probably going to get the crown. Nasser was dead, and so was secularism. The armies had all fought Israel, and they had all failed. If the Middle East was going to unite, it was going to unite around God. And if Israel was going to be pushed out, it would be pushed out by boys wearing vests. That's just the vibe the era was giving off. And in this new fundamentalist arms race, by the time of that massacre in Kana, it was clear that the Shia had taken a commanding lead. When the Americans were pushed out of Lebanon, it was the Shia who did it. When the Palestinians needed a protector, it was the Shia who came to their aid. And when Israel went to war, it was the Shia who faced their bombs. In the streets beneath their gaudy thrones, that Sunni authority was being undermined all across the region, and bin Laden aimed to fix that. Perhaps just as importantly, however, the failure of Kana would mean the Israeli left would lose their election, and in from that historic loss would step neo-fascist Benjamin Netanyahu, supposed counterterrorism expert who came into office with some very clear plans for terrorism. Once in power, Bibi, as he's often known, would waste no time in secretly undermining the two-state solution. Not in public, granted. 75% of the country still wanted it, not to mention Bill Clinton. On paper, he'd have to continue moving the process forward, but behind the scenes, in every possible way, he'd begin tearing out the bones from the inside. When the U.S. brought him in to sign the next treaty on that road towards peace, Netanyahu would respond that the deal was off the table unless they released a Mossad agent who'd been caught spying on the U.S. government. He didn't actually expect it to happen, he just wanted to stall a bit. And then a few months later, after he got home, he declared the whole thing illegitimate anyway. And, naturally, blamed the Palestinians. But that was not all he would do with his time in office, because Bibi had a second plan to stop that Palestinian state. Something a bit closer to his heart, actually. And so at the exact same time that he was declaring war against the terror in the north, in the south, in the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu and his friends in government would ask Qatar to secretly fund Palestinian Sunni fundamentalist groups. To quote Netanyahu himself, it would maintain a separation in Palestinian society. It was an organization that would eventually become known as Hamas. To quote a different member of that same government, the policy was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a burden and Hamas as a benefit. It would hit many birds, that one stone. Allowing Hamas to rise came with the added bonus of creating an enemy that looked far more murderable to foreigners. A beaten people holding a white flag are hard to position as the bad guy, but to a casual viewer of the world's news, it's far less of a problem if those murders happen to an angry, anti-American, Iranian-sponsored Muslim extremist. Hell, people wouldn't even care if you murdered their families. Look at Obama. Plus, if you put them in charge of the government, then everyone kind of worked for them. Then everyone was kind of Hamas. And you couldn't really do that with the Palestinian Authority. So while Israel might never have given them a penny themselves, while they might have never sent a single man to bolster those numbers, anyone who opposed Hamas in Gaza would be hindered by their government, sometimes even destroyed. Hamas, however, would not be touched. They'd even be given thousands of work permits to send their people into Israel and make the money that could fund their rise. As craven as it was, by the early 2000s, it was a plan that had started to bear that rotten fruit. But elsewhere, things were spiraling with a little less control. On May 24th of the year 2000, the Israeli left would briefly take power and pull their armies out of Lebanon, finally ending that 18-year occupation. And naturally, Hezbollah would overrun the areas they'd leave behind, murdering any of the proxy militiamen that had happened to stick around. They'd even show on television the entire operation of them assassinating the head of the SLA. It was an unbelievable propaganda victory. They hadn't just kicked America out, they'd kicked out Israel too. And it wasn't just Nasrallah's supporters who appreciated that. To many people in the north, that news had rang out like a gift from God. The war might actually be ending, because if Israel left, then Hezbollah didn't need the guns. Syria could leave. And that was the moment that they'd been waiting for. And so with that opportunity knocking yet again, Rafiq Hariri stepped back into the light and the prime ministership. It's just, this wasn't a gift from God. It was a gift from Hassan Nasrallah. And you know what? He didn't think the war was over, actually. Sure, Israel went home, but they didn't go home enough. He declared the Israeli-occupied Sheba farms as integral Lebanese territory, and then he strong-armed the central government into agreeing with him. Because technically it was. He was right about that. It just wasn't worth the government fighting over. But Nasrallah needed a legal basis for what he was going to continue to do, and in this little sliver of land, he'd find it. Until it was free, he'd say, he'd keep his guns, thanks. And that was a decision that would only be further entrenched a few months later when the Camp David Accords broke down, Arafat declared war, and Israel responded by voting in their far right. Only now, instead of Netanyahu, the Hydra came under the name Ariel Sharon, a war criminal who'd overseen the worst and least justified slaughter of civilians in the entire Lebanese conflict, a slaughter 10 times the size of the bombing in Kana. And he was no more open to a second state than Bibi had been. His election both reflected and created the tensest internal moment that the Israeli people had faced since their independence. The peace talks had failed, Palestinians were coming for their blood, and the two-state solution now kind of seemed like it was falling out of reach forever. And it was in this moment of boiling point pressure that new hard-right military prime minister decided it was time to light a match. With about 1,000 bodyguards, he entered the holiest place in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, a place that virtually every Palestinian considers not just to be religiously sacred, but also the most recognizable symbol of their nation. To them, Al-Aqsa is more than just a mosque. It's more than just where Muhammad's soul went to heaven. It is the very core of their people. To Sharon, however, it was just a way to poke the bear. The entire exercise was a giant public relations statement to show his people that the two-state solution was never going to work, because if they were going to live together, as the agreement implied, those Muslims would have to accept that the Temple Mount belonged to Israel, legally. He could visit as much as he wanted to. It might be the third holiest site in Islam, but in Judaism, it was by far the first. But it wasn't like he was doing this for equality. It wasn't about justice. He was trying to drive a wedge between the Muslim extremists who this would force to violence and the average Palestinian who was still looking for peace. His visit would lead to 5 straight years of crushed Palestinian uprisings. And in the end, it would achieve exactly what Likud had set out to do. Hamas took power, Palestinians were splintered, and the average Israeli citizen would no longer vote for that two-state solution. They even got to build a wall. On June 10th of that same year, Hafez al-Assad, 30-year dictator and longest-serving leader of an independent Syria, would die in office. The intent had been for his eldest son Bassel to take power, but perhaps that golden knight should have stuck to horses because a car crash killed him in 1994. His brother would be given the throne instead, a man named Bashar, but it was not built for him. Bashar al-Assad did not have the skills of his father, nor his brother. In his job prior to being dictator, he was fitting people for contact lenses, and yet he couldn't even look them in the eye when he spoke. Nobody would have mistaken this man for a natural leader. But for all that he didn't have, he did have one very important piece of the dictatorship puzzle, in that he was willing to kill anybody, at any time, for any reason. And so despite his wormy exterior and complete lack of charm, people would respect him, even if they had to do it from under some dirt. And yet even still, from the beginning of his reign, it was clear that Bashar would not command the same respect as those who'd come before. And so, sensing that weakness, the powers that surrounded Syria would begin to constantly test this new fail-son's resolve, especially once those Saudis got their ogre back. In September of 2001, the United States would face a moment of reckoning they almost didn't believe was possible. An extreme form of Sunni terrorism beyond anything America had even fathomed, striking the very buildings that their predecessors had attacked just 8 years before. That first strike didn't get America's attention, but the second one certainly would. And what's more, despite all the propaganda to pretend that it didn't happen, just like in the 80s, this purely evil destruction would achieve what it set out to do. In 2003, barely 15 months after they were attacked, America would remove its troops from Saudi Arabia. And just as like with Hezbollah before it, that victory would scream across the Middle East like a statement in the sky. In the corner of every mind, that nagging realization that it worked. It worked in Lebanon and it worked in Saudi. 800 men had done what a 1,000,000-man army couldn't. On their end, however, America was not experiencing this clarity of purpose. They were swinging somewhat blind. The hijackers had primarily been Saudi, their leader Egyptian, one of them was Lebanese. So who do you attack? The military had just been written a blank check, and there were more fish to fry than just al-Qaeda, so why not, take the opportunity? America would enter Afghanistan in 2001, Yemen in 2002, and then Iraq in 2003. The stated line was that they'd invaded over weapons of mass destruction, but that turned out to be a rather embarrassing lie. The common joke at the time that the only proof America could find of WMDs was the receipts from when they'd sold them. Most cynics would respond that this was actually about their oil, but that was no more correct than the WMDs. The main objective, as would be stated very clearly by the following Republican nominee for president, was to bomb Iran. And for Bashar al-Assad, only just in his first few years of power, That was basically like watching the future written before his eyes, and what's worse, it was a future that he would not survive. To stay in power, he needed Iranian guns, and for those guns to flow, he really needed that road through Iraq to remain open. Shutting that down wouldn't just mean the end of a Shia-led Syria, but also, presumably, the end of Hezbollah. It might even be the end of Hamas. And so naturally, that was America's main goal. That little strip of land would be convinced towards revolution. Those local Kurds would bear the brunt of this new American adventurism. And in 2004, they'd begin an uprising. That Israeli, US, Saudi coalition's first real attempt at destabilizing Assad. But the country wasn't yet really ready for that chaos, and so they were crushed and broken. But as a statement, it said everything it had to. The axe was coming. And so scrambling in fear, Assad started to make some very serious mistakes. The first of which would happen here, at this exact spot in downtown Beirut. On February 14th, 2005, a truck packed full of explosives evaporated ex-Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. The explosion was so large that they couldn't even find the bomber's DNA. The message could not have been clearer. The future was dead. And Hezbollah killed it. Immediately, without any prompting, every sector of Lebanese society would revolt against the murder. Every single corner that wasn't bought and paid for by Iran took to the streets in anguish. This wasn't killing a man. It was killing the very promise that things could get better. And now, who was even left to protect them, if not themselves? They call it the Cedar Revolution. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the streets. And within weeks, Assad would agree to pull back his soldiers. The occupation would end, and Lebanon would finally be free. The power of a people united. It's just, again, Hezbollah would say no. To remain on top and make sure that nobody ever checked who actually killed that now martyred hero, they'd commit a widespread assassination campaign that would silence dozens of important anti-Syrian voices. On June 2nd, they'd kill Samir Kassir, a columnist who wasn't willing to toe the line. On the 19th, a newspaper editor. 2 days later, they'd kill the head of the Communist Party, and on July 12th, the defense minister. On December 12th, they'd assassinate another editor, and in the following November, they'd kill Pierre Ismail. Not just some parliamentarian, but the grandson and namesake of the founder of the Kataib. In 2007, they'd murder 2 more MPs. And credit where credit is due, they kept power. Even Hariri's son Saad would have to bend the knee. He'd pretend that the witnesses who'd seen Hezbollah kill his father were fakes, and with it, his coalition would collapse. Because if he wasn't willing to stand up for his dad, why should they? But of course he had no choice. He knew he'd eat a bullet for it. Yet as those corpses started to pile, the vultures came to feed. And with Syria on the back foot for the first time since the 80s, Israel saw their moment and struck. The public claim was that it was a response to Hezbollah killings in the Sheba farms, but leaked documents showed it had been planned with the United States months in advance. This wasn't a response to Hezbollah. It was a response to Syria, to the Cedar Revolution. Assad was weak. The road to Iran was cut. It was time to see what they might make of things. But the IDF was not prepared for what they'd face here. They were not the Fedayeen of the PLO. These weren't even the Hezbollah of just a few years ago. And having caught them off guard with this unexpected assault, Nasrallah would turn his tactics towards attrition. Knowing that death affected their morale far more than his, he would not fear the blindness, just so long as he could take out an eye alongside. And so as that invasion mounted, the IDF would start to see a lot of bad numbers very early on, the sort of numbers that scare a government. And yet in public, they'd talk a big game about their successes. It was everything they'd aimed to achieve, they'd claim. The US wasn't so sure, though. As far as their experts could tell, the IDF had only taken out 100 of Hezbollah's 12,000 launch platforms. So that was after 170,000 shells. They shot so many bombs into Lebanon that they almost ran out. What were they shooting? Well, just like they promised in 1993, this was a war of destruction. And Israel was right. It was very successful. Just not at killing Hezbollah. However, if you were the infrastructure, the airport, the seaports, the power plants, the bridges, the roads, the fuel storage, the water treatment, the sewage plants, hundreds of schools, tens of thousands of homes, everything you need to run a state, oh, they'd bomb you to ruin. In 34 days, they did more damage to Lebanon than 20 years of civil war. And again, their brutality would shock the world. As if some historical echo in the exact same village that they'd made famous 10 years before, in the dead of night on July 30th, 2006, the IDF would deliberately target a 3-story residential building that contained precisely 0 Hezbollah fighters. It did, however, contain 50 other sleeping people, mostly children. All of whom would die, of course, although not right away. The first bomb would rip through the ceiling, but for the most part it wouldn't actually kill them. It sure did wake them up, though. Gave them just enough consciousness to recognize what was happening when those uniformed murderers dropped what's popularly known as a double tap, a war crime commonly employed by the IDF to kill those who come to help the wounded. In their mentality, people who would save Hezbollah are no different than Hezbollah. Plus, they're probably medics, and human infrastructure is by far the most important to remove. And just as they'd hoped, in all that horror, things started to fall back towards civil war. In 2008, Druze leader Walid Jumblat noticed that Hezbollah had aimed a secret camera at part of the airport that the politicians used, which in his mind meant surely that they were thinking about assassinating either him or Saad Hariri. And in a rare moment of candor, he accused Hezbollah in public of trying to kill Lebanon's remaining leaders. For anyone but Jumblat, saying those words out loud was an immediate death sentence. And while they couldn't just declare war on the Druze, Nasrallah had been insulted publicly, and he needed to find some response. And so despite their ideology claiming that they would never attack another Muslim, he would focus his revenge on the Sunni of Beirut and Tripoli. For 16 months, they'd fight it out in the streets, although that's a bit of an exaggeration. It wasn't a full conflict, just little pockets of violence. But no matter how righteous a son in avenging his father, Nasrallah had a murder squad, and Saad Hariri didn't. His followers would pack their jackets full of explosives and step right up in your face when they died. Hariri, for all his Saudi billions, just couldn't beat that. And so by 2009, it was clear that his choices were back down or die, and so he backed down. The Cedar Revolution was over. Lebanon remained in the grip of al-Assad. Just not for long. In 2011, in response to an uprising in Tunisia where a fruit salesman set himself on fire, the people of Syria would also rise in revolution. And through them, that Iranian-Saudi Cold War would spark what would become its hottest flame. American, Turkish, Saudi, and even secretly Israeli-backed militants would rise not just against the oppressions of this failed dictator, but the entire standing order of the Middle Eastern region. And as with everyone else, the new incoming ideology would not be some pan-Arab secularism. It was Islamic fundamentalism. In Lebanon, that would mean another huge change to the political landscape. Millions of people were forced to flee from that vicious ophthalmologist, and Lebanon is where they flooded to the most. This country would take in Syrians in numbers no other nation could even contemplate. In a country of just 5 million people, they would see an influx of 1.5 million Syrians. That's a quarter of the population, twice as many people as left Palestine in total during the Nakba. But there was no place for them here. There were no jobs for them. The Lebanese didn't hate them, but they did inspire a great deal of hate. They might have been cousins, but you couldn't just add 1.5 million people to an already failed state. Sure, the UN had promised to send money to compensate, but of course that would never be enough. And to make it all worse, the government had basically come to a standstill. Everything that still existed after that assassination only did so as the purest form of self-interested corruption. Anything that still moved forward in the Lebanese state was only doing so because some politician was ripping it off. There were no leaders, just pigs, devouring what little still remained, and none would be more greedy than Michel Aoun. In 2005, Lebanon would declare all fighters forgiven, and from France would return that famous ex-militant, that supposedly patriotic general who'd once fought a last-ditch effort against the Syrian invaders, he who commanded his men to fight to the death as he ran away. Now, he'd return to Lebanon and be bribed by those very same Syrians. Just as long as he got to be the president, he'd let Assad and Hezbollah keep running the country around him, less like a puppet and more like a ghost. Which, as you might imagine, did not make for a particularly good presidency. In fact, it is often stated from all sides that he has been the worst president that the nation of Lebanon has ever had, and that's a pretty wide field to choose from. His son-in-law and heir apparent is commonly referred to as Lebanon's most hated person, a man listed in the Magnitsky Act, which is a pretty big statement considering it was only supposed to be for Russians. Aoun's betrayal of his nation would cast doubts on everything he'd done before. And while he'd retain his position among a small Christian voting bloc, to everyone else, he would be considered little more than a disease. Whispers even started forming that his first attempt to cast off those Syrians had only come because they'd promised him the presidency if he used the army to fight the Christians, and then reneged on that deal when he actually did it. In the 1990s, that would be considered a fringe conspiracy theory, but by the 2000s, it kind of started to make sense. By the 2010s, the nation had virtually nothing but evil and selfish governments stealing anything that wasn't nailed down. It was the expectation. The future was dead, and at this point, all anybody really wanted was that their garbage come and be picked up. But apparently, even that was too much for the criminals who ruled them, and so with their disgusting, uncollected bins now stinking up every street, again they would rise in revolution, another last-ditch effort to win back their country. But of course, as ever, Hezbollah would say no. And by now, it was probably too late anyway. With the country in open revolt and no vision of the future but more collapse, the final peg holding up what was an otherwise already fake economy crumbled to dust. Every single bank collapsed. The lira collapsed. Within days, even if you could still take out your money, what was it worth? Within months, entire lives had been wiped to nothing. It started in August, and by the end of that year, the entire economy of the country was gone. As a comparison, during the worst of COVID, the GDP dropped worldwide at an average rate of around 3.4%. Countries that got hit really bad saw that number rise to about 8%. Within a single year, the GDP of Lebanon dropped 60%. Unable to pay any of their bills virtually immediately, every single government service would just disappear. With no currency to pay their employees, the power company couldn't keep the lights on. With no money to buy gas, they couldn't even run the generators. If you were lucky, you'd get electricity for around 2 hours a day. But even that was no guarantee. The hospitals, the schools, police, all of them would go unpaid. Government salaries would be dropped from starvation levels to a literal joke. The pay that you would make working an entire day at your job wouldn't even cover the cost of the gas it took you to drive there. And that remains true as I write these words. Police would see their salaries cut to between $50 and $150 a month, if they were lucky. And it's not like the prices were low. If you went in a restaurant, they wouldn't even list them, because there was no point. By the end of the day, it would have already been doubled. Within 6 months, 15% of the entire nation's GDP would come from money sent abroad. But for those who couldn't leave or find a job that paid in a different currency by 2020, that meant they were beyond bankrupt. Rags in the street bankrupt. And even if they worked, the currency that they would be paid in wasn't even worth their time. But thanks to Assad, no matter the pay, no job would go without labor, because with 1.5 million refugees, there was always someone willing to say yes. And so the hits, they just kept on coming. In February 2020, just 6 months after their economy collapsed, yet another shock to the system as the world entered its multi-year pandemic. The nurses already had no salaries. The hospitals already had no gas. How much worse could things get? How much more could that government let them down? Well, on August 4th, 2020, a small fire would break out in the grain silos that line the country's most vital port. Since 2013, they'd been used as storage for nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, but nobody was even paying to store it anymore. The company that had put it there had long since gone bankrupt. The ship that brought it in was even sunk outside the port, and so for 7 years, it had just sat there rotting. At 5:45, the first reports come in of a flame. A team of 10 firefighters would be dispatched to put it out. At 6:07, the first explosion. It would be calculated at 2 tons of TNT, roughly the size of the Oklahoma City bombing. And yet, that was nothing. 40 seconds after the initial explosion came a destruction unrivaled in modern times. I struggle to even describe it. The mother of all bombs is the single most destructive non-nuclear weapon that has ever been created. It contains about 45 tons of TNT. They calculated the explosion that rocked Beirut's harbor at nearly 1,000 tons. It was the 6th largest non-nuclear explosion in recorded history in the downtown of a capital city. The second explosion was so large they could feel it in Cyprus. It blew out the windows of the airport on the complete opposite side of Beirut. Over 200 people would be killed instantly, and the hospitals, already understaffed and overwhelmed by COVID, would face an influx of people that they couldn't possibly manage. But Lebanon is a phoenix. So not 10 minutes after that explosion, and the entire city of Beirut was in the streets with a broom. They didn't fight each other, they didn't loot, they cleaned up the glass, and then they placed those shards into the overflowing piles of garbage that their useless government had left to rot in their streets. And again, the people cried for revolution. How dare these elites, with their money from abroad, with their billions, with their castles, how dare they show their faces? They ruined everything, it was so abundantly clear that these corrupt beasts would never stop squeezing at the throat of this already dead motherland. They would sweep and sweep until they'd swept out the government, that mob of humanity coming from all walks of life, every corner of Lebanon, together organically demanding that every single person in power quit. But Hezbollah would hold the line. You'd have to come and make them. They'd even shoot Lockman slim in the face just to keep things quiet. But this was not 2005, and their position was nowhere near what it had once been. Because in 2022, the main arms producer for that Shia coalition would begin to bleed themselves to death in the factories of Ukraine. With their army stripped bare and not enough manpower to even fight their own conflicts, Russia would back away from their allies. They'd even be forced into importing Iranian drones just to sustain their assault. And that weakness had not gone unnoticed. In December of 2024, Assad would watch as his entire army was liquidated in days. Even with Hezbollah attempting to help, without those Russians, his time was done. And with their allies now in chaos, that dictatorship of Iran was dying on its feet. Oil prices had plunged, the country had run out of water, and they'd even had their own Kurdish revolution. By 2023, that Shia alliance had never been weaker, and Saudi Arabia, under a new Western-friendly regime, would even start making overtures that they were willing to accept Israel as a real country, change that Facebook status to "it's complicated." Which was a symbol in itself that Israel was starting to be seen as a permanent presence in the region, or put in other terms, that the wave of fundamentalism had both crested and was starting to crash. If you asked what the biggest story in the Middle East was on October 6th, pretty much everyone would have told you that it was Israeli-Saudi normalization. MBS had just finished his campaign of mass repression, and now he was going to redefine the entire region around his new personal form of Sunni dominance. He'd turn a luxury hotel into a prison for his relatives, and then those who tried to run, he would shoot out of the sky. He'd even call Hariri all the way from Beirut just to imprison him and demand he kiss the ring, because he was changing things. His Islam would be a capitalist Islam, a new semi-secular dictatorship soaked in the blood of those who refused it. His power would be the ogre's power, and his people a Western people. There was a new era of bribery taking hold in Washington, and nobody bribes better than the House of al-Saud. Hamas would have every reason to be terrified. They could see what was coming. And given their goals, they didn't really have a lot of answers for that. On October 7th, 2023, they would do what they were built to do. And they would attack the Israeli people in a monstrous, horrific single-day assault. It was an unignorable act of terror, meant to inflict a wave of death back onto their own people that would shock the world into remembering the Palestinian plight. For everything else, it was at its core just politics. They understood that as awful as it would be for their people, by invoking the wrath of the Israelis, that new Saudi ideology would only serve to anger the Islamic world, which on his end were like music to Bibi's ears, his long-standing dream of mass ethnic cleansing being handed to him exactly as he'd planned it 3 decades before. To those far-right Israelis who'd clung to the government, this was a generational opportunity for murder. Their enemies had never, at any point, been weaker, physically or politically. And even better, his allies had never been more bribed into submission. So even as it started to become clear that this was not about rooting out Hamas, even as the defense minister described them as animals, even as the ICC issued a warrant for war crimes, the Western world would mostly turn a blind eye. In America, both political parties would agree on the answer and would spend untold political capital attempting to hold back anti-Israeli commentary. To quote the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, "My job is to keep the left pro-Israel." The most critical pieces of press would not come from abroad, but from Israel itself. In the United States, the media landscape would be far less critical. Journalists at the news outlet The Atlantic would even be exposed as having secretly written Israel's speeches to the UN, at the same time that they were supposed to be covering the person who was reading it, no less. Yet, Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than have died in almost every single American war since 1910 combined. They have killed journalists in numbers we've never seen in any other conflict in all history, and they did it within a single year. Yet the international press barely even noticed. The moment this war began, Israel would flip a switch that would cut all electricity, fuel, and water to the people of Gaza. They would shut down all telecommunications and stop all incoming aid. They controlled every single facet of daily life since before the war began, and they even had the walls around them to prove it. But it was okay, because they were Hamas. According to the leaked numbers from the IDF, 84% of all Palestinian dead have been civilians. That's the best case scenario. The military is repeatedly and knowingly undertaking a form of revenge known as collective punishment. It's a war crime first documented in the Holocaust, but to paraphrase a leaked audio of the former head of Israeli military intelligence, the Palestinians need a Holocaust every now and then. But it's okay, because they're Hamas. Netanyahu would repeat in the world's press as much as he could that the goal was the release of the hostages. He would say that Hamas are the new Nazis, and the foreign press would repeat those words verbatim. But in Israel, the story would be very different. His was not a popular government, and the families of those kidnapped openly stated many times that they did not believe that Netanyahu was trying to get them back. They would consider themselves and their loved ones pawns meant purely to unshackle their government's fists. And when the first hostages released spoke of good treatment by their captors, the government immediately set about silencing them. From the very beginning, to anyone paying attention, the goal was always the liquidation of Gaza. If not the people, certainly the population. Members of Netanyahu's government would even speak of it as a, quote, real estate bonanza, their publicly stated dream, nothing less than the total resettlement of the entire Strip's population. They even got Trump to demand it. By September of 2025, 92% of all Gazan houses would be destroyed. 92% of all schools, 88% of all shops, 89% of all water treatment plants. 1 in 33 people would have been murdered, 125 hospitals destroyed, over 1,700 healthcare workers alongside. Instead of just double taps, when bombing Gaza's hospitals, the IDF has started to drop a third. The rescue crews learned to wait for a second, so if you really wanted to kill them, you have to use a third. Get rid of that human infrastructure. And alongside the bombs, they'd also start a campaign of black bagging. 28 doctors would be kidnapped and jailed without trial, dragged from their hospitals, ambulances, and even their homes. They've been held in Israeli prisons for what is now 600 days. 2 have even died. And they're joined by 3,600 other people who are being held without ever having been charged with a crime. To call it a genocide is both true and also still somehow underselling the case. But let's jump back to Lebanon. The crisis in Gaza gave Hezbollah no good options. They didn't want to join. The country around them was rioting, and just to keep their hand on the reins, they'd had to restart the assassinations. But weak or not, they had to do something. What would it say if they didn't? And so, for Nasrallah, ever the tactician, that meant doing the bare minimum. A little yelling on TV and then launching a couple rockets into the Sheba farms. It was a statement to Israel that he didn't want to fight. Not now, anyway. And again, to Netanyahu, that was the music that he'd been looking to hear, because it didn't matter what he did. This was a trap that had already sprung. Mossad had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, and now unshackled by the brutality of that attack from Hamas, there was nothing Nasrallah could do but face the wrath of that Israeli fury. The IDF turned north, and they started their second front. The beginning of the 2024 invasion of Lebanon was unarguably a war crime. The Israeli Secret Service had sold Hezbollah thousands of bombs that they'd inserted into pagers which would then be handed out to virtually every major figure in that organization, which included, quite tellingly, Iran's ambassador to Lebanon. But it wasn't just pagers, it was walkie-talkies, air conditioning units, anything they could get a bomb inside, they'd put a bomb inside. And on September 18th, those pagers would all explode. 42 people would die, some of whom would be bystanders who just happened to be nearby. Some of them would be children. And alongside those dead would be injured thousands of people. Obviously, not all of them were Hezbollah, but at the same time, a bunch of them were. And when compared to their conventional bombing campaign, the numbers here were about as good as you would ever get. And so credit where credit is due. If the goal was to get rid of Hezbollah, that was a pretty effective way to do it. And just like those Shia suicide bombings had once been towards them, this new form of illegal warfare followed none of the rules and got all the results. Combined with their standard bombing campaign and constantly being fed secrets from the country's poorest and most broken people, those Israelis would effectively root out the entire leadership of Hezbollah within a week, something they'd been looking to do for 30 straight years. In January of 2025, with Hezbollah broken and America lurking in the shadows, Lebanon would elect a new government. The president would come from the army and run on the promise of a true, full disarmament, something that just a year before would likely have got him killed. His statement, as he diplomatically put it, was that the army of Lebanon alone would be the one to kick out the Israelis. And it's not like Hezbollah had much of a choice. Lebanon had changed, so they signed the paper. But just as soon as that ink was dry, that new president would see the arrival of Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, a judge on the International Court of Justice, a single year ago, and he too would be killed just for his resume alone. But the moment he took his seat, he did what Hezbollah had killed so many to stop and restarted the inquiry into who murdered Rafiq Hariri. The Christians and the Sunnis seem aligned. Hezbollah's response is to say that they are making a, quote, major sin. And from that, violence seems almost inevitable. But the future, as always, is unclear. Will Hezbollah disarm without a fight? I honestly don't know. But I hope so. Because for all that's happening in Gaza, it isn't like they stopped it. For all the destruction that's come to Lebanon, most of it has come in their name. They didn't weaken Israel. They propped up Assad during the worst of his democide. They killed so many innocent, freedom-loving Lebanese just to keep power. They killed the future. And in the end, what did they even get? Iran's losing the Cold War. They've likely already lost. And while they may have some very real justifications for their anger, even if their intentions are good, they've long since paved the road to hell. As we enter into 2026, Lebanon remains a nation destroyed. Its economy is still in tatters, and yeah, there's a ceasefire, but only one side seems to have ceased firing. This is not a happily ever after story. This is a story of silver linings. And so to end today's video, as well as this series, I want to focus on the one that I experienced the most, the one thing that couldn't be bombed out of Lebanon, and that is its people. It is without exaggeration to say that in the 150 plus countries that I've been to on this planet, there has been none as friendly and welcoming as Lebanon. When I would walk the streets, people would invite me into their homes and give me food that they barely had. When I passed by shops, they would rush out to give me some free gift. All they wanted was that I experience their country positively, and because of the people of Lebanon, I did. For all of its history and culture and food and beauty, the thing that makes that country great are the Lebanese. And so it pains me to say that as we enter 2026, those very same people are being forced to live in the ashes of their nation. And yet, it is from the ashes where they have always been born. Lebanon is a phoenix. And I truly hope that this time we get to see those wings. Happy New Year, everybody. This is Rare Earth.